The rescue. Draconia was a planet of extremes. Its fiery skies during the day blazed with the light of twin suns, and its nights were a tapestry of cold indigo hues speckled with alien constellations. Captain Leon Hayes trudged through the barren expanse of the Ember Wastes, a hostile desert region where jagged obsidian cliffs pierced the horizon and volcanic vents hissed with noxious fumes. He was there on a reconnaissance mission, tasked with investigating illegal poaching operations targeting Draconia's rare and dangerous fauna. Leon had always been known for his keen instincts, but even he couldn't have predicted what he would find that day. A sound cut through the oppressive silence, a low, guttural growl followed by a high-pitched whimper. Leon froze, his sharp hazel eyes scanning the terrain. The noise wasn't natural to the wastelands. Adjusting his visor's thermal settings, he detected a faint heat signature near a jagged outcrop. Cautiously, Leon moved closer, his plasma rifle ready. What he saw made his breath catch. Pinned beneath the twisted remains of a poacher's energy snare was a creature unlike any he'd ever seen. Its scales shimmered with an iridescent sheen, catching the light like liquid fire. Massive wings, torn and bloodied, lay crumpled at its sides. Its elongated neck and angular snout exuded both power and grace, but its fiery golden eyes, filled with pain and fear, spoke of its suffering. It was a Dracone Apex, the deadliest dragon in the known galaxy. Leon had heard the stories. These dragons were said to be unstoppable predators, capable of reducing ships to slag with a single blast of their molten breath. Yet as he stood there, watching this magnificent creature struggle against the snare, all he saw was pain and fear. The dragon let out a weak growl as Leon approached, its massive frame trembling. Its golden eyes locked onto him, narrowing in warning. Leon hesitated, his training screamed at him to retreat, to call for reinforcements. But something deeper, something human, compelled him to stay. "You're hurt," he said softly, lowering his rifle. "I'm not here to hurt you. Let me help." The dragon snarled weakly, its claws scraping against the rocky ground. Leon took a slow, deliberate step closer, keeping his hands visible. He could see the snare's energy tendrils biting into the dragon's scales, the crackling arcs of electricity causing visible burns. It wasn't just injured, it was dying. Leon crouched beside the dragon, his heart pounding. He pulled a small plasma cutter from his pack, its glow casting flickering light across the creature's shimmering scales. "This is going to sting," he murmured, "but I need you to trust me." The dragon let out a low growl, its breath hot and labored, but it didn't lash out. Leon began cutting through the snare tendrils, the energy field sparking and hissing with every pass of his tool. Minutes felt like hours as he worked, sweat dripping down his face despite the cool night air. Finally, with a sharp crackle, the last tendril snapped. The dragon let out a guttural roar, flaring its wings briefly before collapsing back onto the ground. Leon stumbled back, his hands shaking. "There," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're free." The dragon's golden eyes locked onto him once more, and for a moment Leon thought it might attack. But instead, it lowered its massive head, exhaling a hot, smoky breath that ruffled his hair. It wasn't submission, it was acknowledgement. "Let me get you patched up," Leon muttered, pulling a medkit from his pack. He worked quickly, applying advanced biogels to the worst of the dragon's wounds. The creature didn't resist, its gaze steady and unblinking. By the time Leon finished, his hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer awe of what he'd just done. As dawn broke over the Ember Wastes, Leon stepped back, admiring the dragon's imposing form. It was still weak, but its eyes burned with renewed life. "You're going to be okay," he said quietly. The dragon let out a low rumble, its head tilting slightly as though understanding him. Leon smiled. "Yeah, I'll take that as a thank you." As he turned to leave, the dragon let out a soft growl, stopping him in his tracks. He glanced back to see its golden eyes watching him intently. For a moment, man and beast stood in silent understanding. Then, with a powerful beat of its wings, the dragon took to the skies, its silhouette cutting across the fiery morning sun. Leon watched until it disappeared, knowing that something had changed forever in those brief moments. He had no idea that he had just saved Safira, and that their story was only beginning. The weight of secrets. The Ember Wastes became a memory as Leon returned to his outpost, his report sanitized to omit the most critical detail, the dragon. He couldn't explain why he'd left it out. Perhaps because he knew what the military would do if they discovered he'd freed the galaxy's most dangerous predator. They'd hunt it down, dissect it, and turn its existence into a weapon. Weeks passed, and Leon threw himself into his duties, but the memory of the dragon lingered. He'd wake in the middle of the night, hearing its roar in his dreams, the sensation of its warm, smoky breath on his face, the glow of its golden eyes. They haunted him. "You're distracted, Hayes," Major Cree said one evening, her sharp gaze studying him over a stack of mission briefs. "You've been out of it since the Wastes. Something happened out there?" "Just poachers," Leon lied, forcing a tight smile. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Cree raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "Well, shake it off. We've got bigger things to worry about. Command's talking about deploying more troops to Draconia. Word is the Apex population is becoming a problem." Leon's stomach churned. "A problem?" "Too many sightings near settlements," Cree said. "Command wants to cull them before they become a threat." Leon nodded stiffly, his heart sinking. He couldn't help but think of the dragon he'd saved. Was it still alive? Had it healed? And if it was found, would it become one of the targets in Command's cull? One night, unable to sleep, Leon found himself staring at the stars from the base's observation deck. The vastness of space felt oppressive, the weight of his secret crushing him. He closed his eyes, imagining the dragon soaring through the skies of Draconia, its wings cutting through clouds like blades. "You're probably better off without us," he murmured to the night. "You don't need our wars, our greed." But the wind carried no reply, only the distant hum of the planet's nocturnal life. Yet deep down, Leon felt a flicker of hope, a sense that the dragon was still out there, alive and thriving in the wild. It was a bond he couldn't explain, a connection forged in the heart of the Wastes. Days turned into weeks, and the military preparations intensified. Leon watched with growing dread as transport ships arrived, carrying specialized hunting equipment designed specifically for taking down Apex dragons. The soldiers spoke excitedly about the bounties, the glory of bringing down such legendary creatures. "It's necessary," Commander Walsh explained during a briefing. "These creatures are too dangerous to coexist with human settlements. One wrong move, one territorial dispute, and entire colonies could be wiped out." Leon wanted to speak up, to tell them that the dragon he'd encountered had shown mercy, intelligence, even gratitude. But the words stuck in his throat. Who would believe him? And even if they did, would it change anything? The night before the first hunting expedition was scheduled to launch, Leon made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. He accessed the military database and subtly altered the patrol routes, steering the hunting parties away from the sectors where he believed his dragon might be hiding. It wasn't much, but it was all he could do without completely betraying his oath as a soldier. As he logged off the system, his hands shaking, Leon realized he had crossed a line. He was no longer just a man who had shown mercy to a wounded creature, he was actively protecting it, even at the cost of his duty. The hunting expeditions returned with mixed results. Some apex dragons were captured or killed, but many more seemed to have vanished into the deepest parts of the wastes. The soldiers complained about faulty intelligence and bad luck, never suspecting that their own fellow officer had sabotaged their mission. Leon told himself it was for the greater good, that some creatures deserved to live free. But late at night, when the guilt weighed heaviest on his chest, he wondered if he was becoming the very thing he'd sworn to fight against, someone who put personal feelings above the safety of humanity. The dragon he'd saved remained a ghost in his thoughts, a golden-eyed specter that reminded him daily of the choice he'd made in the wastes. He could only hope that somewhere out there, she was safe, free, and alive, unaware of the man who continued to shield her from the shadows. The final goodbye. Leon Hayes's mission on Draconia was coming to an end, and he couldn't shake the growing ache in his chest. His deployment had been extended twice already, but the message from Galactic Command was clear: he was needed elsewhere. The clock was ticking, and his window to revisit the Ember Wastes, to see her again, was narrowing. For weeks, he had carried the memory of the dragon like a stone in his chest. She haunted his dreams, her glowing golden eyes filled with pain, trust, and a strength that seemed otherworldly. He had given her freedom, saved her life, and in doing so, tied a piece of himself to her forever. But he hadn't returned to the Wastes since that fateful day. Duty and fear had kept him away. Now, standing in the outpost armory, strapping on his gear one final time, Leon knew he couldn't leave without seeing her again. Whether it was closure or some kind of promise, he wasn't sure. All he knew was that he had to go back. The journey to the Ember Wastes was as harsh as he remembered. The terrain was unforgiving, with jagged obsidian rocks cutting through the horizon and the air thick with the acrid stench of sulfur vents. The dual suns hung low in the sky, casting long, ominous shadows across the wasteland. Leon navigated carefully, his visor scanning for heat signatures. The memories of their last encounter played vividly in his mind: her torn wing, the snare biting into her scales, the defiance in her eyes even as she lay wounded. He'd freed her, patched her up, and watched her fly away. But what if she hadn't survived? What if she'd been hunted, or worse, died from her injuries? Don't think like that, he muttered to himself. She's stronger than that. Hours passed as he combed the wasteland, his hope dwindling with every step. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hiss of a nearby vent. He was beginning to think he'd made a mistake, wasting precious hours on a wild chase, when a sound stopped him in his tracks. A roar. It wasn't distant. It wasn't faint. It was close, and unmistakable. Leon's heart leapt as he sprinted toward the sound, his boots pounding against the uneven ground. The roar came again, echoing off the cliffs, powerful and alive. When he crested a rise, his breath caught. There she was. The dragon, Safira, as he'd come to call her, stood in the center of a rocky clearing, her massive form silhouetted against the setting suns. Her iridescent scales glimmered like liquid fire, and her once tattered wing was whole again, healed and strong. She turned her golden eyes toward him, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Leon stepped forward cautiously, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "It's me," he said softly. "Do you remember?" Safira let out a low growl, her eyes narrowing. For a terrifying moment, Leon thought she might attack. But then she lowered her massive head, her breath hot and smoky as it brushed against his chest. He let out a shaky laugh, his hand resting gently on her snout. "You're alive," he said, his voice thick with relief. "You're okay." The dragon rumbled softly, a sound that felt almost like a purr. Leon smiled, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't quite name. This wasn't just a creature he'd saved, it was something far more profound. As the suns dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, Leon sat beside Safira, her massive frame curled protectively around him. The silence between them was comfortable, the bond they shared palpable. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said quietly. "Command's sending me off-world. I don't know when, or if, I'll be back." Safira tilted her head, her golden eyes studying him. Leon sighed, running a hand through his hair. "But if I can, I'll come back. I promise." The dragon let out a soft rumble, nudging his shoulder gently. Leon smiled, his chest tightening. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, he knew this moment would have to last him a lifetime. "Goodbye, Safira," he whispered. "Stay safe." As he walked away, he glanced back once, catching the sight of her majestic form silhouetted against the night sky. The memory burned itself into his mind, a farewell he'd carry with him for years to come. He had no way of knowing that this goodbye was not an ending, but the beginning of something that would change both their lives forever. In the distance, Safira watched him leave, her ancient eyes holding secrets and promises that only time would reveal. The bond forged in those wastes was stronger than either of them knew, a connection that would transcend time, space, and the vast loneliness of the galaxy. Years of separation. Time moved differently in space. Missions blurred together, the days and weeks melding into a relentless grind. Leon's career in Galactic Command flourished, he earned promotions, accolades, and the respect of his peers. But despite his success, a part of him remained forever anchored to a barren wasteland on a distant planet, where golden eyes had looked at him with trust and understanding. 5 years had passed since Draconia. 5 years since he'd said goodbye to Safira. Leon, now a decorated colonel, found himself stationed on Kepler Station, a massive orbital facility that served as a hub for deep space exploration. His days were filled with briefings, tactical planning, and the endless bureaucracy of military life. But his nights belonged to memories of iridescent scales and the warmth of a dragon's breath. He tried to forget, to move on with his life. There had been other assignments, other worlds, other challenges. He'd even attempted relationships with fellow officers, but nothing seemed to fill the void that Safira had left in his heart. His colleagues noticed his distant demeanor, the way his eyes would sometimes focus on something far beyond the present moment. "You've got that look again," Captain Martinez said one evening as they shared drinks in the station's observation lounge. The stars streaked past the massive viewport, a river of light in the darkness. "Like you're seeing ghosts." Leon forced a smile, taking a sip of his synthetic whiskey. "Just thinking about old assignments." "Draconia?" Martinez asked. Leon's time on the Dragon planet had become something of a legend among his peers, though the official reports mentioned nothing about his encounter with Safira. "I heard that place could get under your skin." "Something like that," Leon murmured, his gaze drifting to the stars. Somewhere out there, beyond the void, was Draconia. Was Safira still alive? Had she found others of her kind? Did she ever think about the human who had freed her from the poacher's trap? The questions haunted him, but he had no answers. Draconia was classified as a restricted system now, off-limits to civilian traffic and heavily monitored by military patrols. The dragon culling operations had been deemed a success, with official reports claiming that the Apex population had been managed to sustainable levels. Leon wondered how many of those magnificent creatures had paid the price for humanity's expansion into their territory. His guilt over sabotaging those early hunting missions had never fully faded. Late at night, in the quiet of his quarters, he would question whether he'd done the right thing. Had his actions led to attacks on human settlements? Had people died because he'd allowed dangerous predators to escape? The weight of those possibilities pressed down on him like a physical force. But then he would remember Safira's eyes, the intelligence and pain he'd seen there, and he knew he couldn't have acted differently. Some bonds transcended duty, transcended the cold calculations of military strategy. What he'd shared with that dragon in the Ember Wastes was something pure, something that reminded him of the humanity he'd sworn to protect. The years took their toll. Leon's hair began to gray at the temples, lines appeared around his eyes, and his once athletic frame grew thicker with age and sedentary duty. He'd become the kind of officer he'd once looked up to, experienced, respected, but carrying invisible scars from decisions made in the darkness between stars. On his 42nd birthday, Leon received news that would change everything. A priority message from Galactic Command, marked with the highest security clearances. As he read the contents, his blood ran cold. A new mining operation had been approved for Draconia's northern continent. The area was rich in rare minerals essential for faster-than-light drives, and corporate interests had finally convinced the military brass that the potential profits outweighed the risks. Leon's extensive experience with the planet made him the natural choice to oversee the operation's security. He was going back to Draconia. As Leon stared at his orders, his hands trembling slightly, he felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. Part of him yearned to see those twin suns again, to breathe the sulphurous air of the Ember Wastes. But another part feared what he might find, or what he might not find. Would Safira still be there, or had she become another casualty of humanity's relentless expansion? The thought of returning to discover her death, or worse, to be the one responsible for bringing the destruction that would claim her life, filled him with a despair he hadn't felt in years. But he had no choice. Orders were orders, and Colonel Leon Hayes had never been one to shirk his duty, no matter how much it might cost him personally. As he began preparations for the journey back to Draconia, he could only hope that fate would be kinder this time than it had been in all the years that had passed. The stars outside his viewport continued their ancient dance, indifferent to human concerns, carrying with them the light of distant suns and the promise of reunions that might heal old wounds, or tear them open once more. The return. The mining operation on Draconia's northern continent was in full swing when the first attack happened. Colonel Leon Hayes stood in the command center, watching the security feeds with growing unease. The corporate executives had assured him that this region was safely outside the known Apex territories, but Leon's years of experience had taught him that dragons were far more intelligent and far-ranging than most humans believed. "Sir, we've got movement on perimeter sensors," Sergeant Collins reported, his voice tight with nervousness. "Heat signatures, big ones, approaching from the southeast." Leon felt his stomach drop. He'd been dreading this moment for weeks, ever since arriving back on Draconia. The planet felt different now, more hostile, more wounded. The twin suns seemed dimmer, and the very air carried an undercurrent of tension that made his skin crawl. "How many?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 3, no, 4 contacts. "They're moving fast, sir. Faster than anything should be able to move through that terrain." Leon closed his eyes for a moment, remembering golden eyes and the trust he'd seen there so many years ago. "Stand down the defensive systems," he ordered quietly. "Sir." Collins looked at him in shock. "With respect, those are Apex dragons approaching. Protocol demands." "I said stand down," Leon repeated, his voice carrying the authority of years in command. "I'll handle this personally." Against the protests of his staff and the panicked objections of the mining executives, Leon left the safety of the command center and walked out into the Draconian wilderness. The familiar heat of the twin suns beat down on him as he made his way to a rocky outcrop that overlooked the mining site. He was unarmed, wearing only his standard uniform, trusting in a bond that had sustained him through years of separation and doubt. He didn't have to wait long. The first dragon crested the ridge like a living mountain, its scales catching the sunlight in a dazzling display of iridescent fire. Leon's breath caught in his throat. It was Safira, older now, larger, more magnificent than he remembered. But she wasn't alone. Behind her came 3 smaller dragons, their scales a slightly different hue but unmistakably her offspring. They moved with the fluid grace of apex predators, but there was something in their approach that spoke of caution rather than aggression. Safira landed 50 meters away, her golden eyes fixed on Leon with an intensity that made his knees weak. For a moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, she began to approach, her massive head lowered slightly, not in submission, but in recognition. "Hello, old friend," Leon whispered, his voice thick with emotion. When Safira was close enough, she exhaled a gentle puff of warm air that ruffled his graying hair. It was the same gesture she'd made all those years ago, a sign of acceptance and trust. Leon reached out with trembling hands, placing them against her snout just as he had in the Ember Wastes. "You remember," he said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "After all this time, you remember." Safira rumbled softly, a sound that Leon felt in his bones. Then she stepped aside, revealing her 3 hatchlings. They were beautiful creatures, each bearing the same intelligent eyes as their mother, the same aura of barely contained power. "Your children," Leon breathed, understanding flooding through him. "You brought them to meet me." As if in response to his words, the smallest of the 3 hatchlings approached, sniffing curiously at Leon's outstretched hand. When it didn't detect any threat, it allowed him to touch its scales, as warm and smooth as polished stone. "They're incredible," Leon murmured, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't name. "Just like their mother." For the next hour, Leon sat among the dragons, feeling more at peace than he had in years. Safira's hatchlings gradually overcame their initial wariness, allowing him to examine their wings, their claws, their magnificent scaled hides. They were perfect predators, but in their eyes he saw the same spark of intelligence and capacity for trust that their mother possessed. As the twin suns began to set, painting the sky in familiar shades of red and gold, Safira rose to her feet. The message was clear: it was time for them to go. Leon stood as well, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this reunion, like their last meeting, would have to end. "Thank you," he said simply. "For trusting me with this. For letting me meet them." Safira touched her snout to his forehead one last time, a gesture that felt like a blessing. Then she turned to her offspring, issuing a series of low calls that sent them scrambling into flight formation. As the dragon family took to the skies, Leon watched until they were nothing more than specks against the darkening heavens. When he finally turned back toward the mining site, he found his entire security team waiting for him, weapons lowered, faces filled with awe and confusion. "Sir," Sergeant Collins said carefully, "what just happened out there?" Leon looked back at the sky one more time, then smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in years. "I kept a promise," he said simply. In the days that followed, Leon submitted his final report to Galactic Command. The mining operation could continue, he wrote, but with strict protocols in place to respect the indigenous dragon population. The Apex dragons had shown remarkable intelligence and restraint, and coexistence was not only possible but preferable to the alternative. He didn't mention the specifics of his encounter with Safira and her hatchlings. Some things were too precious, too personal to share with the cold bureaucracy of military command. Instead, he requested immediate reassignment to a desk job on Earth, claiming that his years of deep space deployment had taken their toll. On his last night on Draconia, Leon returned to the outcrop where Safira had brought her children to meet him. As he sat under the alien stars, he felt a sense of completion that had eluded him for years. The bond forged in the Ember Wastes had come full circle, transformed from a moment of desperate compassion into something deeper and more meaningful. He had saved a dragon, and in return, she had saved his soul. The transport ship that carried Leon away from Draconia lifted off at dawn, carrying him back to Earth and a well-deserved retirement. As the planet fell away beneath them, Leon pressed his face to the viewport for one last look at the world that had changed his life twice over. Somewhere in those vast wastelands, Safira was teaching her children to hunt, to fly, to survive in a galaxy that often showed little mercy to those who were different. But she was also teaching them something else, that sometimes, across the vast differences of species and circumstance, understanding and compassion could flourish. It was a lesson that Leon carried with him for the rest of his days, a reminder that the bonds we forge in our darkest moments often become the light that guides us home. Years later, as an old man sitting in his garden on Earth, Leon would sometimes look up at the stars and wonder about Safira and her family. He liked to imagine them soaring through Draconia's skies, free and wild and magnificent, their golden eyes reflecting the light of twin suns. In those moments, he knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice all those years ago in the Ember Wastes. Some connections transcend time, space, and species. Some bonds, once forged, last forever. The end.